Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you all took time to be here today and talk about farm safety from the food safety side of things. This is the last in our month and a half long, month and a week, right, long series on farm safety, and we saved food safety for last. So, welcome. Glad that you're on. I've got a few intro slides, and then we'll jump in. So today we're going to talk about on-farm food safety, a common sense approach to deciphering the rules, regulations, and general basic good practices. So we're going to cover a lot of information. Um, excuse me. My name is Ariel Agenbroad. I'm a University of Idaho Extension area educator. I work in community food systems and small farms. I'm located in Boise. I didn't change this slide. I am not in the Northern District, but I do work statewide in terms of my work with on-farm food safety. So that's not entirely untrue. So just a quick little reminder that Cultivating Success was established in the year 2000 by University of Idaho, WSU Food Systems, and the nonprofit Rural Roots. And I've been with Cultivating Success since 2003 in some way or another. So I really love what this is all about, and I thank you for joining us. And I hope that you'll check out cultivatingsuccess.org to find out about all the other resources and opportunities that we have for our small farmers through that program. So today's topics, what are we going to talk about? I probably planned a little bit too much, but I get kind of carried away when we're talking about food safety because there is so much to talk about. It's not always everyone's favorite to talk about. I'm really impressed that as many of you have logged on as you have, and I hope that you come away with some useful information. I really, really do. So we're going to talk today about food safety, why it matters, where it begins when we're talking about your small farm. We're going to talk primarily about how food safety principles are applied to produce farms, but we will also talk about considerations when you have an integrated crop and livestock system, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the regulations that are around value-added products and cottage food products, including a really brief discussion on some new legislation in Idaho that just came about, which kind of changes what we've done up until this point. But more on that later. So I'd like to start out just with kind of a little bit of having you think about what it is that you want to produce and where you want to produce it. Because I'll tell you, each of these items has a different kind of level of rules or regulations applied to it or not. And then depending on where you're selling, again, we start to add layers of complexity onto that related to especially food safety. So if you are just going to sell raw, uncut, fresh produce, and uncut means you can absolutely have the harvest cut, but you're not, cutting it into little like snack pieces or salad mix or, bite-sized pieces of carrot, right? Raw, uncut, fresh produce is probably the easiest entry with probably the least amount of regulation, but can also very importantly have potential food safety risks. So any of these other things that you might want to do, if you want to grow organically, you want to produce garlic, maybe you want to get into more the flowers and the plants rather than the food crops. Again, there'd be less going on with food safety in that regard, but maybe more with other regulations. And then if you want to start getting into value-added products, right, the jams, the jellies, any kind of processing, that's going to add levels of complexity in terms of regulation and potentially also food safety and who needs to be involved. And then how you're going to sell or market your products, whether it's going to be on farm through a CSA or community supported agriculture subscription, if you're going to sell at farmers markets or maybe multiple farmers markets, or maybe you want to get into a retail store or online. Again, each of those different entities, except for your own farm and your CSA, are likely going to have their own requirements and expectations for food safety, for licensing, for things like that. So again, selling raw produce from your farm may be one of the easiest entry points, depending. But we also have to think about what the rules are around people coming to your farm. We've got other presentations on some of those details. That's not really what we're focused on today, but I just wanted to start with that because the more you do, the more you produce, the more you process, and the more ways that you sell it, the more complex this is going to become. And that's not necessarily a problem or an unsurmountable barrier, but it's just something to be aware of and keep in mind as you go forward in whatever it is that you want to do. So let's get started talking about some food safety fundamentals. I really like to introduce this as everyone's responsibility. So sometimes you might think like, well, I'm a small farm. I'm not really, I'm doing safe things. I don't have to worry about this. I'm not going to get anyone sick. I've been growing this forever in the same way and no one's ever had a problem. That's wonderful. And keep doing it that way. But from everyone from the largest manufacturer of food products to even when you're growing food for your own family, food safety really is everyone's responsibility. And there are always ways that we can make our food more safe and less likely to come in contact with any contaminants. But fresh produce and food products that you make, even if you're making them at home, they're not inherently dirtier or more risky than anything else. There's just this expectation sometimes, I think, that if we're raising it at home, then we don't have anything to worry about. And while these products are not inherently dirty, there are definitely still ways that contaminants can enter the food system, even from a very small scale. And that's because they can become contaminated under certain situations with pathogens that can make people really sick. And scale, it does not necessarily be the only determining factor of this. Yes, sometimes if you're in a large factory setting, you can contaminate a lot more food at one time. But even on a small farm, if something were to happen and a contaminant was to be spread, you could still make that small amount of people sick, including your own family or yourself. When we talk about these contaminants, we're really mostly thinking about bacteria and viruses. So think Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, Campylobacter, and then some of the spoilage type bacteria that might not put someone in the hospital, but they can give them a few days of being very, very uncomfortable. When we're talking about prepared foods, we're also thinking about things like allergens, food spoilage, and other kinds of contaminants that might be the main issue with those processed or packaged foods. Whereas the bacteria and viruses that will live on live produce in water are going to be the primary concern in produce. And all of these things have the potential, like I said, to make people ill in varying degrees. And then there are also some of the human pathogens that, if we're sick and we handle produce, that could be spread to someone else. So spring is coming. Farmers markets are opening in the next few weeks and months. And I just absolutely love this picture of fresh berries. I can't wait for the season to get started. If you're a market gardener, thank you so much for what you do. And I hope to see you at market. But let's talk about produce. Now, some of you may already have heard about these two words. And some of you might be thinking, I have no idea what those letters are. Is this some kind of test? No, I don't want to test anyone. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. This stands for the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule. So for the past, excuse me, over 10 years, we have been, in the United States, we've been under this new legislation, the Food Safety and Modernization Act. And it was the first time that the FDA was given the authority to regulate food from farm to fork on a national scale in response to multiple foodborne illness outbreaks related to fresh produce and other components of the food system. FSMA, for short, has about 7 different rules in it. We're specifically going to talk about the Produce Safety Rule, which covers fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, herbs, mushrooms, and sprouts, and microgreens, including, that are commonly consumed raw. The reason that we're worried about these foods potentially is because they are consumed raw. They're not cooked. And when you cook produce, you often are providing that kill step that would negate any kind of pathogen. Now, who is going to be covered by this act? You might say, I've never heard of this. Does this impact me? It may impact you in certain ways, whether you know about it or not. But the level to which it impacts you entirely depends on the size and scale of your operation and who you sell to. So some farms are just not going to meet the sales minimums required to be fully covered by the rule. And other farms will be in a middle range where they qualify for an exemption based on sales and who their customers are. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more. So if you're one of these 4 types of farms, you're not covered by the rule at all. This does not apply to you. So if you don't grow any of the produce that is covered by the rule, so you don't grow any fresh fruits and vegetables that are covered, then you wouldn't be. And some examples of that would be potatoes and sweet corn and beets and winter squash and pumpkins. Because they are not commonly consumed raw, they are not viewed as being as much of a risk. And so there is a very short list of the crops that are not covered, and I can provide that to you as a handout or later on. But if you are only a sweet corn and pumpkin grower, you're not going to be covered by this rule. If you are growing all this food for personal use or consumption, you're not going to be covered by the rule. They're not getting into home gardens. If you are growing, maybe you're growing tomatoes or green beans, but you grow them specifically for processing, they're going into canned or some other kind of processed food, then you again will not be covered by the rule. And then if you gross $25,000 or less in your produce sales over a 3-year average, you are small enough to not be covered by the rule and not have to comply with the components of them. Now, I mentioned that you might qualify for an exemption. So this again is kind of hitting a little bit larger farm, but still providing a way for them to opt out of a lot of the regulatory burden of the FSMA produce safety rule. So if you sell $500,000 or less of total food, so that includes produce and anything else, and you sell half or more of your products to a qualified end user directly, then you would be exempt from most parts of the rule. A qualified end user is the immediate consumer of the food. So like you're selling at farmer's market or through a CSA, you're selling directly to that person. Maybe you sell to a restaurant or to a retail food establishment directly, not through a wholesaler, but you take the delivery to your local co-op. If that retail food establishment or restaurant is located in the same state, whether you're in Idaho or Washington or Indian Reservation, or not more than a 275-mile radius from your farm, then you qualify for an exemption. And we'll talk about the requirements of that exemption towards the end. So to know whether you're covered or not, I just mentioned some of the ways that you could not be covered, but if you kind of aren't quite sure where you fall into that, then you just need to gather up the types of produce that you grow, your average annual gross sales of produce, your annual gross sales of all food products, and the percentage that are sold directly to that qualified end user, right? Or like I said, individuals or families, restaurants, or a local grocery store or retail store. So you can pull all that information together, and that helps you to make the determination of whether you are going to be impacted by the produce safety rule or not. So if you're on this call, you have an interest in food safety, you might be wondering about GAP, or Good Agricultural Practices certification. And a question we get often is FSMA the same as GAP? Is it like GAP? Is it not? So I can address that right now. So like GAP, the rule does focus on preventative best practices that are going to minimize your food safety risks on farm. So a lot of the principles and practices of preventing foodborne illness are part of GAP, and they're part of FSMA. Both are here to help protect your investment, to protect your farm and the consumer of the products that you grow and sell. And then these two do require some of the similar record keeping or documentation. So if you are covered by FSMA and you're also seeking GAP certification, very often the same records that you use for one will also be useful in the other. But there are some very key differences between GAP and FSMA. So unlike GAP, so GAP is, or Good Agricultural Practices, is a third-party certification audit. It's usually done by either someone from the State Department of Agriculture who's been deputized to do the audits. They have to be trained and certified through USDA to do this audit. And there's for-profit companies and also government agencies that will do this certification for you. It is an optional market-driven audit that is usually required by the distributors, the large retail markets, or institutions. So a school district might require you to be GAP certified in order to sell to them. A wholesaler like a Charlie's Produce or a Grasmick Produce might require you to be GAP certified so that they can buy your products and distribute them to these other institutions. So there are no laws that require you to be GAP certified. It's a market choice that you make so that you can unlock these additional markets for your produce. However, the produce safety rule is different. These federal laws affect all farmers, whether they are aware of them or not. And so that's why we'd like to talk about this and help you to prepare so that you're not caught off guard if someone asks you about this or asks you if you're qualified exempt and you say, this is the first time ever hearing about this. So we're going to come back at the end of this section and we're going to talk specifically about kind of your next steps if you are a produce grower and you want to be absolutely sure that you're either in line for the exemption or maybe you're not covered at all. So we'll get back to that. But now we're going to kind of sit back and just talk about some of these major key elements of produce safety and how they relate to a small farm. So I've got, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pictures up here. And these all reflect something that we're going to talk about related to food safety. So you probably can already start getting an idea of what we're talking about. We're going to talk about poop. We're going to talk about soil amendments. We're going to talk about animals, water, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens after the harvest. So hang on with us. And remember, if you have any questions that you want to put in the chat, please do so. And I will pause and check those occasionally. And we'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, at the end of today to also talk about that. And I apologize if I go too fast. I prepared a lot. You can always go back to the recording. You can always go back to the slides, and you can stop me at any time to ask a question. All right, let's start with people. Okay, the people who are on your farm, whether it's you and your farming partners, your family, any employees or volunteers or interns or customers that may spend time on your farm. All of these people have a role to play in the on-farm food safety on your property. So humans can be a major farm food safety concern. They can also be the way that you protect yourself from all of this. So people can contract, share, and transfer pathogens. Primarily, they do this when they are either sick or injured because we're talking about blood and bodily fluids. And if you're eating your lunch during this webinar, I apologize. We will be talking about poop at several times during today's talk. So this primarily happens when there has been some kind of accident, or most likely and most commonly, when hands have been contaminated and hands move on to do additional work on the farm, working with produce, packing produce, handling produce, etc. And we're really specifically thinking about 3 primary ways that hands can become contaminated. They can be either contaminated by human or animal feces or manures, right? Because these are active sites for disease-causing organisms. They can also contact contaminated surfaces, clothing, shoes, tools, and equipment, and those can move pathogens around in the farm area. And then contaminated water is a very quick way to contaminate a lot of produce because most organisms, like especially bacteria, they thrive, then they require water. And so if you have water and the water is moving through your system and it's contaminated and it covers the produce, covers your hands, covers your work surfaces, then you're contaminating all of those places with this water. So we have to think about people. So how do you lead the way as maybe the primary farmer or the farmer in charge on your farm? Number one is, who is in charge of food safety on your farm? Is it you, or have you designated someone else to be in charge? It's a really good idea to pick one person who that is their assignment. It might not be their only assignment. You know, most of our small farmers are doing everything, and that can be a really big challenge. But someone needs to be the one who is in charge of food safety and is that number one contact, who makes the decisions about your practices and who can actually enforce and make changes when they see them. So designate an individual who will be that point of contact for you and will be responsible for both designing, implementing, and evaluating on-farm food safety on your farm. And it's best that this be someone that knows the farm really well and is really familiar with the practices that and the way that you do things, so that they can look for those pinch points or potential areas for improvement. So when we think about worker health, hygiene, and training, very often on a small farm, the training is not very formal. Rarely do we know small farmers who set everybody down in a classroom and say, all right, we're going to have 2 hours of PowerPoint before we go out into the field today. It's really not practical and not usually how things are done. But be thinking about how you can train everyone at your farm about what it is that you do to ensure that food safety policies and practices are in place, and be accountable for those, because everybody has a really important role to play here. And if they understand that it's about preserving the safety of your farm, protecting your investments, and then also protecting your customers. A lot of people go into farming because they want to feed others. Nobody goes into farming because they want to make someone else sick. Right? So train everybody, and that includes your family, your employees, your customers, visitors to the farm. If you are supposed to be compliant with the rule or with GAP, then you do want to have actual formal trainings at least a couple times a year, document these trainings, and have sign-in sheets. If you are not covered by the rule, that might be a little bit of an extra step. But thinking about how you would engage with visitors to the farm, whether you have signs saying, please leave your pets in the car, hand washing is over here, keeping certain areas away from visitors. Doesn't mean that you have to have a total closed system, but there are a lot of reasons, from biosecurity to food safety, why you don't want people just to run rampant on your farm. So this talks a little bit more about visitors in specific. So some things that it's really helpful for visitors to know when they come on the farm, especially if they do not have any prior experience or understanding about agriculture, which if you are in an agritourism area, this is probably going to be a lot of the folks that come to your farm. So make sure that they all know where the toilet and hand washing facilities are, if you have them, what activities are allowed or not allowed while they're spending time on the farm, if there are areas of the farm that are off limits, and if you require any kind of sanitation or protective gear. I've been to farms where the first thing they do when you get out of the car is they say, welcome to our farm, here's some booties. We raise livestock here, we might have poultry, we're really trying to keep things clean. We don't know where you have last been or where your boots have been, so please help us out. And then use signage if appropriate. People don't always read signs, but that can help protect you a little bit if you've got signage out and you've made that very clear to people. So that's a little bit about people. Now we're going to talk about water, because like I said, water is one of the primary ways that contamination can be spread throughout a farm or a processing facility or a packing house. So when we talk about water and food safety, we talk about it before harvest and we talk about it after harvest. And those are two very different times. Very often the water that you would use pre-harvest can be different than the water that you use after harvest. It's more important for the water after harvest to have certain qualities to it that we'll get to in a minute. And it's really, we often have no control over the quality of our agricultural water, especially if we are reliant on irrigation and we're on an irrigation district, or we have surface water that we're using to irrigate on. So number one, when we talk about pre-harvest water, we're defining it as water that is used in your production that is likely to contact produce in some way. And this could be irrigation. It could be water in your spray mixes. It could be water that you use to cool things down, whatever. So all agricultural water, this is in the rule, right, must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. That's clear as mud, huh? This is really a sticking point because there are so many variables, right? What some water that might be safe and adequate sanitary quality for use on leafy greens, which are harvested, within days of planting, might be completely different for water that you're using to irrigate fruit trees where the fruit is growing several feet above the ground and never comes in contact. So thinking about the timing of when you harvest, where that water is coming from, and how it's supplied. Is it overhead sprinkler? Is it drip? Is it underground drip? All of these things may potentially have an impact on what kind of water should be used for that purpose. And even if your water potentially is, it's coming from an irrigation district, you anticipate that it has pathogens active in it, there are tools that you can use to estimate how long between irrigation and harvest you would need for the die-off of some of those pathogens. So it's not saying that you can't use irrigation water, it's just thinking about where your water comes from and how it's being used on your farm. And does that potentially create any sort of risk? So you're responsible for identifying what risk factors might be present on your farm. And this is one of the hardest ones to understand, especially in Idaho, because we have so many different kinds of water and we use it in so many different ways around the state in agriculture. Now, post-harvest, this is a little bit more straightforward and I feel like a lot clearer to understand and communicate to people. So this is any water that's going to come in contact with fresh produce or hands or work surfaces during and after harvest. So this is out of the field. This includes water that you're using to rinse or wash or move produce, any water that you're using to cool down and remove field heat or ice. It might be if you're applying any post-harvest fungicide or wax applications, and it covers all hand washing of employees and staff that are touching produce. And it includes also any water that you're using to clean surfaces and areas where produce is handled. So it's good to remember again, right, that water can still, even if the water starts out clean, it can still become contaminated with human pathogens and easily transmitted. So this is the lowdown, is that only potable water, so water that is free from any detectable E. coli, is going to be appropriate for post-harvest activities. So in most cases, if someone has access to municipal or city water or treated water, that's what they're going to use for all of their post-harvest activities. So that you're not washing your cut produce with surface irrigation water and then putting it out on the shelf. That's basically it. Now, why is this an issue? All right, well, surface water, so maybe you're watering from a lagoon or an open ditch, this can be the highest risk for contamination because it is open to the air all the time. Anything can get in there. I mean, an animal could stumble in and die and be in that water supply. You wouldn't know if you're downstream. So surface water has the highest amount of risk. Groundwater is kind of in the middle depending on where it's coming from. And sometimes it's absolutely fine. Sometimes it can be contaminated. But then a public water, so this is either your city water or maybe you have, and groundwater could include a well as well. That's bad. Groundwater can include your wells, and it is important, we'll talk about this in a second, to make sure you understand if your well water is clean and if there are any potential contaminants or other issues in your well water. The potentially safest water is going to be public water from a municipal system because it is treated, it is tested regularly, and so it's generally considered to be of a lower risk. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this. So I talked about how farmers are responsible for understanding and reducing their risks related to water use on their farm. So you may be wondering, well, I don't know how I know that, right? How do I do this? So I'll just give you a few tips. Number one, know your water and where it comes from and what you're using it for. And really think about, especially that post-harvest water has to be particularly clean and document where that comes from. You can test your water. If you get water from a public water supply, keep those records that sometimes they send out. It's a good idea to test your well water, maybe annually. And you could test your irrigation water throughout the season, but if you've ever used irrigation water, you know that it's different from one day to the next. But if you were just curious about, like, maybe especially as you get close to harvest, what is in that water, it might not be a bad idea to get that tested. And then how we take care of the water that we have, right? This is going to be really key. If you have a ditch on your property, if you are on the canal system, can you manage waste and livestock and wildlife in any way to avoid contamination of that surface water? You may or may not be able to. But you do have a certain amount of control when it comes to your own private well. You can inspect that wellhead. You can make sure that things aren't, coming in contact with it, that you have protections so someone can't drive into it, that animals can't get into it, that everything's sealed up so that critters can't get in and die. It's a really good idea to check that throughout the production year, especially at the beginning of the season. And again, test that well water. All right, now we're going to talk about soil amendments, right? We'll get into this a little bit. So why should we be concerned about soil amendments? Well, typically what we're using in soil amendments are animal manures. Maybe we're using composted bedding. Maybe we have a neighbor with animals. Anytime we're talking about poop or manure, we're talking about bacteria, viruses, or other parasites that can potentially make people sick if you're using that manure as a soil amendment in its raw state. If you are applying that to the edible portion of a growing crop, maybe it contaminates your hands or clothes or shoes or equipment and then is transferred to fresh produce. Or maybe you're storing those materials in a way that allows for them to blow, drift, or run off into sensitive produce areas. So how we manage soil amendments that are based on animal waste are very, very important. We're less concerned by like vegetative composts and things like that. There are very low pathogenic risks in that. There might be chemical risks and other things like that. But we're particularly worried about animal manures and how they're handled and processed. So how do you reduce risks on your farm if you are using animal manures as an important part of your fertility and soil health program? So I don't know that I really have to say this one, but you just never know. So never use human waste to fertilize crops, and this includes not pooping in the field. Use a scientifically valid method of composting to treat raw animal manures. So this would be thermophilic or heat composting or forced air composting. Using a scientifically valid method ensures that you get to the right temperatures for the right amount of time, and that is going to make those pathogens inactive and make that manure product a lot more safe to use as it becomes compost. Another way that you can reduce that risk is, say that you don't have the capacity to do on-farm composting at a large scale. You can just stretch out the amount of time between when you apply that manure to a food crop and when you harvest it. And so if it grows in contact with the soil, you want there to be 120 days between when you put that on and when you harvest the product. So we're talking about things like maybe a head of lettuce that's sitting on that soil surface, or root crops that are going to be eaten raw. If you've got another crop that grows above the ground, you can put 90 days in there. So what this basically means is that you don't want to spring apply any raw manure to a food crop. You want to do this in the fall, pre-winter, right? So that it has time to have that amount of time between the application and harvest. And that is the length of time that is observed by the organic standard as well, because many, many organic growers use manures as their fertility product. And then if you do have these products on your farm, carefully store, manage, and transport them separately from some of your finished soil amendments. So if you buy or bring in finished compost, don't store it in the same place with your raw manures or your active piles. Keep those separate so that you're not potentially cross-contaminating. All right, and speaking of poop, we're going to talk about animals themselves as a risk factor and how we might want to deal with this in a crop situation. And we know that a lot of our small farms are integrating crops and livestock together, and that's really important. That helps close those systems, right? We're producing fertility products, we're feeding animals potentially from what we're growing. It's really sound agricultural practice. So we just have to think, though, about, do the animals pose any kind of food safety concern? And that's because, like we said, animal waste is one of those really common sources of contamination. And this is true for both domestic or wild animals, livestock, and pets. So anytime an animal is going to enter a produce field and deposit feces, it doesn't matter what kind of animal they are. It can be a bird, it can be a cougar, it can be a dog. It's potentially bringing contamination into the system. And then when that manure is then interacting with wind, water, tools, hands, shoes, etc., it can become easily transferred to produce, and then it can start to be a problem. So there's only so much that we can do sometimes to manage this. Animals of all kinds are really a constant presence on many small farms. We talk a lot about encouraging wildlife on your farm in different ways. But we know that their waste products can help contaminate fresh produce. So be thinking about what are the potential sources for animal intrusion or contamination on your farm. And do you have any kind of plan in place that helps either to discourage animal presence in those sensitive crops that like the fresh produce? And what can you do about it? And can conservation and farming coexist? Absolutely. We just have to be more thoughtful if we are growing fresh produce that gets consumed raw by consumers. It's just where we have to spend a little bit more time being a little bit more vigilant about preventing animal intrusion into those areas. So what are some other ways that we can manage risk from animals on your farm? So like I said, know your risks. You know, we have animals on our farm, or we live next door to a feedlot, or we are on a wild bird corridor, right? Migratory birds. What are the risk factors that could potentially impact your farm? And then do you have a plan for how you might address that, how you might deal with that? And we can certainly help you with a lot of resources about that if this is something that is of concern to you. As much as you possibly can within your control, exclude wildlife, livestock, birds, and pets from actively growing produce crops. And then inspect your crops throughout the growing season. You know, you may find evidence that animals were there without seeing the animals themselves. So be watching for that. And then really the simplest way to do this, don't ever pick or harvest anything that has poop visibly on it. So if it has bird droppings on it, if it has deer droppings or whatever, just leave that in the field, incorporate it back in, and train yourself and any workers just to not pick it. Don't even bring it in. You might bring in a contaminated piece of fruit. It goes in the bin with all the other fruit. It rains. Now it's just gone through the whole system. So leave it in the field. All right, so we're moving right along. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what happens at harvest and market, right? So getting your produce from the field to the marketplace and some best practices here. And again, you know, a lot of these are things that we've taught over, you know, multiple day sessions. So we're just scratching the surface here today. So you go through all that work to keep your produce safe in the field. And now you've harvested, and now this is equally as important to keep that produce clean from the time it's harvested all the way to the time where it becomes used by that consumer. So there are plenty of opportunities along that way for produce to become contaminated with pathogens. So what are we going to do to help make sure that that doesn't happen to the best of our ability and with what is under our control? So just thinking about the chain of how things happen on your farm, and this is a good time to think about this depending on where you are in your production season. If you're just starting to ramp up, you've got stuff growing in the high tunnel, you're getting ready to do your first harvests. How is your product harvested, handled, cooled, washed, packaged, stored, transported, and or displayed? Are there any points along that way where you think there could be potential risk for contamination? And if so, is it possible to make any changes? Can you try to do things a little bit differently? Or just being aware of that might be all it takes, just to be thinking like, I got to wash my hands. I know I was doing something. I got to just stop, wash my hands, and then go get that out of the walk-in cooler. There are potential risks associated with each of those steps, and it's going to be entirely different based on the way your farm is laid out, where you do certain things, how you do certain things, and who does them. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's really up to you to be thinking about that system and how you work within that system. So looking at the places where contamination happens, Number one, surfaces of any kind. So that can be our harvest tools, like right from the scissors or the shears that we use. It can be the harvest totes. It can be the tables that we put produce on. If we are fancy enough to have conveyor belts and things like that, it could be that. Where you're storing that produce in between harvest and maybe its final package. Your packaging materials themselves, any storage racks, coolers, and then, of course, very, very important, your worker hands, your worker clothing, and then the surfaces around where you work. So walls, ceiling, and floors, if potentially there could be splashing, there could be condensation, there could be touching of any kind, those could all have an impact. And then can these surfaces be adequately cleaned and, when necessary, sanitized? And that's a really good question to ask yourself. Surfaces like wood may not be sanitized as easily, but they can certainly be cleaned. And there's no rule that says you have to use everything sparkling stainless steel in your packing house. But the materials that you use, can they be cleaned? And then if they can be sanitized, are you doing that too? And that also goes for things like your handheld coolers, like your big igloos, but also if you have any kind of cold storage. Pest management falls into this, right? So controlling for rodents, both in your produce storage areas and maybe also where you store packaging and harvest materials. And this would be keeping these areas safe from birds, rodents, insects, etc. We're not so much worried about insects particularly, but anytime there's movement, we could be moving pathogens around. So having a pest management plan in place to help assure that you do not have these critters bringing in contamination. And if you have a way to do a regular schedule of inspecting, trapping, or removal, that would be a good idea. Okay, the last step is record keeping, everyone's favorite, right? How are you going to document some of this stuff, and do you need to? Let's talk about that. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about records and farm food safety plans. So first of all, I'll tell you that the produce safety rule, even if you are fully covered by it, it does not require you to have a farm food safety plan. So I'll just put that out there. However, a GAP certification would, and you might just think about this, even if you're very small, could you have a written food safety plan? Because it's really been proven to be beneficial to farms of all sizes. It helps keep you organized, and it helps keep that focus on food safety at the top of your mind. It helps to maybe have a written record of your practices, your policies, and some of your operating procedures, especially if someone else needs to take something on for you. Maybe you have an injury, maybe you have an absence from the farm, maybe you're bringing on a new farming partner and you want to teach them about the things that are important to you. If it's all in your head, it's not as easy to share with someone else. It can also be a way for you to keep track of important records that maybe you need to show your organic inspector or you need to show your buyers, depending on how big of an operation you are. And it helps you to know what to do if a situation occurs so that you can go back and say, yeah, we addressed this in our farm food safety plan, and here's what we do when the porta potty tips over into the field, which we hope would never, ever happen. All right. So I talked earlier about how most likely our small farms are going to be exempt from most of the parts of the produce safety rule. And so what do you have to do to prove that you are qualified exempt? So I'm going to talk about that right now. First of all, you need to keep sales and tax documents that show your total food sales over the past 3 years. And if they are under $500,000 adjusted for inflation, great, you've checked the first box. Second, you've got to have some kind of documentation that you make over half of your sales to qualified end users. So right to those direct to consumer, to a retail grocery, through a CSA, to a local restaurant, right? So over half of your sales need to be to that direct consumer or market. And then this one is really interesting. I don't know if everyone knows about this, and I don't know how much it's being enforced, but this is a requirement of the rule. And so we should all be doing what we can to comply with it. So whether you are covered or not, whether you're exempt or not, we have to prominently and conspicuously display the farm name and business address at the point of sale. And that's been in effect since 2020. And I'll show you what that looks like. But going back just a step. So if you are in Idaho, the Idaho State Department of Agriculture requires that you submit a verification form to establish your exemption. Otherwise, they are going to find you, whether they're at farmers market, whether they're looking at websites, whatever. If they have a whiff that you are producing an agricultural crop or a produce crop, they're going to reach out and say, hey, we just want to find out a little bit more about you. We don't want to come and do an inspection if you are exempt, so we just need this verification. They've made it a lot easier now to do this. So you can go online, you can annually submit your verification that you're qualified exempt. They have it on a hand paper version that you can print out. You can also do it online. And then if you're trying to figure out those averages and the inflation data, they have a worksheet to help you with that. So this is a QR code that takes you to that website. And the folks over there, I worked with them for many, many years. I have found them pretty good to work with. They just want your farm to be safe and in compliance, and they'll help you through some of this. And I can always help you through some of this as well. So that's how you would verify that you're exempt, right? And then the labeling. So here's just a few examples. So maybe you're packing in clamshells, maybe you've got big bags, maybe you're selling in little bags to a retail market. Your farm name and your business address need to be on that product so people know where it came from. This way they can contact you to get more of it, right? But if there was ever any kind of issue, they need to be able to let you know. And this is true for the retailers that you sell to as well as your direct consumers. So here you've got some clamshells, some bags, some individual bags, whether it's a Ziploc or something fancier, that farm name is on there. And then also maybe it's just on display at your point of sale. So again, it doesn't have to be fancy. Here it is written on a dry erase board at a farmer's market or farm stand booth. Maybe it just goes with the produce that you're selling to a local farm stand who aggregates that produce for you. And then maybe it's just on your website if you're doing only online sales. So however you're selling that, it needs to be clearly and conspicuously displayed. All right, so if you still don't know where you might fit in that produce safety rural landscape, we have developed an online anonymous decision tool that helps you just go through and answer these questions about what do you grow? How much do you sell? This doesn't collect any of that data. It doesn't share it with anyone. It just spits out to you kind of a choose your own adventure. Guess what? You're probably covered. Or good news, you're probably qualified exempt. Here's what to do next, right? And so you can either go to that link or you can use this QR code to go and follow up on that and see if you're covered, okay? And we'd be happy to help you with that. All right, well, I think this should be enough time. So we've got about 10 minutes. Now we're going to shift gears from thinking about our fresh produce to thinking about some of the other products that you might produce on your farm. So thinking more about that value added side of things. So maybe you want to make some baked goods or some dried herbs or some jams and jellies from what you grow. Lots of reasons why you might want to do value added products, right? It could be that you've got an overabundance at the end of the season and you really want to continue to use that product. You don't want anything to go to waste. Maybe your customers really love your value added products and they're demanding it. They're saying, well, we'd love to see you at the winter market, and that tomato jam that you make is just the best thing ever. And like I said, maybe it is that you have a potential to sell throughout the winter or in the off season, and having a shelf stable product helps you to continue to have a sales outlet. And then maybe you also want to expand into a new market and bring that with you. So lots of reasons why you might want to produce these things. Going to be some different considerations for each of them. So two great resources that I highly recommend. The one on the left is starting a craft food business in Idaho. This is put out by the Idaho State Department of Agriculture and Idaho Preferred, and it really goes through the nuts and bolts of starting a very small scale food business. And it actually will take you even further down the chain. Maybe you want to do something that would be, maybe even a larger type product. So everything from your home kitchen to a commercial kitchen or a co-packer, that would be where you would go to look for that. And then our other guide, this is a publication through our Cultivating Success program. We all had a part in this. This is really just guiding a lot of different ideas for small and direct marketing. It covers food safety, but it covers a lot more as well. And that can be a great place to find out, is there a rule associated with what I want to do or a regulation? And can I find that out before I start investing or spending a lot of time doing something that I may have to backpedal on? So these are two great resources. And again, these slides will all be posted on the website. So the other place that you need to start when you're thinking about any kind of food product, whether you're going to be, starting a food truck or, selling something at market, you've got to check in with your local health district. And so you can start by going to the statewide health and welfare site and learning a little bit about the food protection program. And then you can go to your individual region's office or your health district and make contact with someone there to get going on what is going to be required for the type of product that you want to use. This is also where you would go if you wanted your water tested, whether it's your well. This is where you would test your private well. If you were going to develop a product that was maybe low acid and you wanted some help with that, your local health department is really they should be viewed as an asset. I know they're not always, and sometimes it can be really scary. But most of the folks that I've worked with are there to help you. They want to keep people safe and they want to support Idaho businesses as well. And you may have a different experience, totally okay. I wanted to just really briefly, as I was putting this presentation together, this was brought to my attention just in the last few weeks. So if you have been following the Idaho State Legislature, they passed, and it was signed by the governor, SB 1283. This is the Direct-to-Consumer Food Sales Act. This is something new. This follows some activities in other states like Alaska. If you've been following this, if you've been really involved in small-scale food production, it's pretty big. I'm not sure exactly how it's all going to play out or what kind of guidance we're going to have access to, but it's something I wanted to bring to your attention. And the idea that this would be in effect by July 1st of this year. So what is it? There are three parts of this. Number one, it expands what you're able to legally produce and sell in a home kitchen. Previously, you were only allowed to make and sell things that were non-time temperature control sensitive. So, really safe products like cupcakes, that didn't have a cream cheese frosting. You could do jams, because they have so much sugar in them. There was a list of things that you could produce in a home kitchen. This has expanded that list pretty significantly to include prepackaged items like canned vegetables, tamales, barbecue sauce, and pickles. Pickles were never included in this before. So, I have a lot of questions. As somebody who's been working in food safety for a long time, part of me goes, oh my gosh. But the other part of me that supports our small scale food entrepreneurs is like, this opens up a lot of opportunities. But first person to get sick from something like this is going to throw a wrench in it. So how can we all kind of move forward? I don't know. We're going to find out more. The second part of this is that, yes, you may be able to expand what you're selling, but they do have to have very clear labeling that this was produced in a home kitchen that is uninspected, and it does still have to have your contact information, lists of ingredients, and allergens on there. The third part of this bill is that it's just differentiating that this is still, if you were going to do a food truck or you're going to open a restaurant, you still have to be inspected, and you have to do that in a certain way. But this is also saying that you could potentially take that unlicensed good and you could sell it to like a small farm market or something else, and they could put it on a retail shelf separated from the other things. Like the Doritos would be on one side and your homemade food would be on the other side, and it would be clearly marked. So this will be really interesting to see how this is going to play out over the next little while. But like I said, this does not apply to restaurants, fair vendors, food trucks, etc. They still need a health permit. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you contact your local health department or follow this link to read more about that bill. I do not feel competent and knowledgeable enough to answer a lot of direct questions about what that's going to look like. But I thought if we're talking about prepared foods and value-added products, it's something I certainly needed to share with you so that it could inform what you're doing moving forward. So again, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different health districts, depending on where you live in the state. And this would be your point of contact for any kind of food products, not produce, not anything like that, but food products that you want to make. So cottage foods and maybe foods that are part of this new bill. These slides were prepared before that news came out. So for the most part, this is still relevant, and especially through July, this is still the way I think we would be doing things. So cottage foods, this is again allowing you to produce certain kinds of food in a home kitchen and to distribute those directly to consumers without any regulatory oversight. They're not going to come inspect your home kitchen. However, your cottage foods must include labels that provide contact information for your operation, clearly state that this food was prepared in a home kitchen that is not regulated or inspected, and that it may contain allergens. And so those things are going to still be the same. It's just the list of foods that can be produced has expanded. So this was what was formerly allowed as a cottage food. So anything that does not require refrigeration, dried foods, mixes, popcorns, jams and jellies, honey, fruit pies, not pumpkin because it would have to be refrigerated, many kinds of breads, nuts, trail mixes, granola, things like that. But now this list is going to expand and I'll have to redo these slides. Okay. You are not required to to have a food establishment permit, but this is something to think about. When you want to sell to a certain farmer's market, they may require that you have a permitted kitchen. They are allowed to supersede the rule and say, we only allow these things at our market. Many, though, are allowing cottage foods, but I just wanted to make it clear that a market could say, we don't allow these, and that's just part of them reducing their own risk and covering their own liability. You can connect with health and welfare. You can fill out an assessment about your cottage food, and if this is on file, then you've done your due diligence and you're not going to be bothered by an inspector at market. This is really optional, but it's highly, highly recommended so that they know what you're doing. And so if there are any potential risk factors, they've helped you identify that. And then I would like to say too, even if it's legal and you're going to be producing food at home, why not increase your food safety knowledge and skills? You can take really easily food safety trainings and exams. You can reach out to Extension, take a class through our food preservation instructors. You can look at this online. It's something that you might want to do, and that just might help to kind of establish yourself and your confidence in that the way that you're creating those foods, the way that you're cleaning in your kitchen, etc., are the safest that they can be. I think it never hurts, right? All right, so what do you want to do if something is not on the list? Well, it might be on the list now, and if it's still not, you can actually test the product by working with a private laboratory to find out whether it meets certain requirements. Again, this slide is kind of now, I don't know what that's going to all be like. So best case is just contact your health district, talk to them about what it is that you want to produce. And is it now a cottage food? Is it still not? Where do you go from here? Okay, so in summary, what you grow or make, where you sell it, how you sell it, who you sell it to may all shape how you're going to be expected to comply with food safety rules and regulations. Everybody is responsible for assessing their risks and taking all possible precautions to keep our food supply safe at every step. This protects you as a producer, and it protects our consumers of our food. This was the last in our spring safety session of webinars through Cultivating Success. All of these recordings are going to be available on the Cultivating Success website along with the slide decks. You can always reach out to us through the website or individually if you have questions about food safety, safe families, farm biosecurity, agritourism. It's been a really great session. Not always the most exciting stuff that everyone wants to talk about. I was joking today that right now with this weather, everyone wants to talk about pollinators and other fun stuff and crops and season extension. But thank you for coming and talking about farm food safety. I really, really appreciate it. It's really important.